So imagine you're navigating the modern digital dating landscape right now. You're chatting with someone for, I don't know, a few days, and the banter is actually good.
Yeah, rare thing.
Right. You're finding common ground. You're starting to hope for that spark of like genuine connection, and then your phone buzzes.
Oh, no. I know where this is going.
You do. A notification pops up. You open the message, expecting to see a face, a smile, maybe just the candid shot of this person you've been getting to know. But instead, you are greeted by a cropped, completely disembodied, strictly anatomical photo.
The classic faceless image.
Exactly. And it is incredibly jarring. It feels entirely disconnected from the actual human being you thought you were talking to. Like you were looking for a person, and instead you just received this biological mechanism.
It's wild because it happens all the time in modern digital culture, yet it never really stops feeling slightly surreal when you're on the receiving end of it.
Yeah, totally.
Most people tend to just brush it off, We categorize it just a crude internet habit, or terrible digital etiquette, or, maybe a really clumsy, misguided attempt at initiating intimacy.
We do. We just write it off as like guys being guys on the internet. But today, on this deep dive, we're actually looking at this phenomenon through a completely different lens. And honestly, it blew my mind.
It is a fascinating perspective.
It really is. We are unpacking an amazing paper from July 2026 by Russell Alistair Dench. It's titled, let me get this right, The Disembodied Proxy, Male Expendability, Digital Objectification, and the Erasure of Identity in Modern Visual Culture.
A very academic title for a very relatable problem.
Right. Now, real quick, Dench's paper does touch on some pretty intense cultural politics regarding gender and sexuality. And since we are diving into this, I just want to say to everyone listening, we aren't here to take any political stances on his work or endorse specific viewpoints from the right or the left.
Exactly. We're just looking at the data.
Yeah, we are purely here to impartially unpack the behavioral science he presents. We just want to see what his research reveals about human behavior and the sort of invisible structures shaping how we interact online.
And Dench's core premise, it really completely upends the conventional wisdom on this.
Yeah.
He argues that this truncation of the male face is not merely about rudimentary privacy or, a lack of social grace. If we trace this behavior back, we actually find its roots tangled up in the history of 20th century media, the psychology of risk assessment, and ultimately, and this is the wild part, the historical foundations of societal labor and warfare.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when I first read that thesis, it sounded totally wild to me.
Yeah.
Dench is arguing that a guy sitting in his apartment today, like cropping his face out of a photo before hitting send, is actually acting out a deep-seated manifestation of male expendability and cognitive bias.
Yeah, he is.
So to understand why he does that, Dench says we basically have to go backward in time. We have to look at how the modern visual language, like the actual template for male disembodiment, was literally invented by the media men were consuming decades ago.
Right. We really have to look at the media genealogy that Dench maps out here. He starts by looking at the golden age of adult films. So this is roughly like 1969 to the early 1980s.
Oh, okay.
The aesthetic and the production values of that era were completely different from the internet content of today.
Yeah.
Films were shot on actual 35mm film stock.
Wow, yeah.
They had real budgets, directors, and they were screened in mainstream theatrical venues where people actually bought tickets and sat in an audience.
Yeah.
But crucially, and this is the main point, the male actors in these films were highly visible.
Because they were actual characters in a narrative, right? They had speaking lines, character arcs, and you actually knew who they were.
Exactly. You had performers like Jamie Gillis and John Leslie, and they possessed distinct, recognizable public identities. Like audiences knew their names. Their faces, their dialogue, their emotional reactions to the scenes. All of this was central to the cinematic experience. The camera would actually linger on their expressions. So in that era, the male performer was a fully realized, integrated human subject on the screen.
But then the technology inevitably changes and the economics just shift dramatically because the late 1980s brings the VHS boom.
Right, a huge turning point.
Suddenly, people aren't going to physical theaters to watch this stuff in a crowd. They're renting tapes and they're watching at home in complete isolation. And that disrupted the entire business model, didn't it?
It completely dismantled the traditional narrative framework. because the economic viability shifted away from these high-production theatrical story arcs and moved toward hyper-segmented, low-budget gonzo content.
Ah, okay.
Dench points to directors like John Stagliamo who realized, well, if a guy is watching a VHS tape alone in his living room, he doesn't really care about character development or a traditional three-act structure.
Right, he's not there for the plot.
Exactly. So Stagliano physically took the camera off the tripod, placed it directly into the action, and popularized point of view, or POV, cinematography.
And this is where the literal erasure begins, right? Because to optimize that first-person experience for the guy at home, the director has to get the actual actor out of the way. Like, if there's another guy's face on the screen, the viewer is just a spectator watching someone else's experience.
Yes, exactly. The technical shift served a highly specific psychological purpose, which was maximizing the simulation of a first-person experience. So to allow a heterosexual male consumer to project himself seamlessly into the scene, the on-screen male performer had to be systematically erased.
Wow.
The actor was reduced to just like a disembodied voice behind the camera, or perhaps just a pair of hands interacting with the scene, or, an isolated lower half. The holistic male body was literally cut out of the frame. It became a blank canvas.
A functional proxy.
Exactly, a functional proxy for the viewer to step into.
It makes me think of the transition in video games. Like, think about the difference between playing a third-person adventure game where you see your character running around the screen versus playing a first-person shooter.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. In a first-person shooter, you don't see the character's face. You literally just see a pair of floating hands holding a tool or a weapon at the bottom of your screen.
Because you are the hands.
Yes, you are the hands. The character's unique identity is removed entirely so you can insert your own. And Dench points out that the early 2000s internet and the massive explosion of those tube sites codified this exact aesthetic. They essentially made the visible male face an actual disruption to the fantasy.
What's fascinating here is the conditioning that this creates over time.
Yeah.
I mean, long before smartphones or digital dating apps even existed, our media diet had firmly established the male body as a functional proxy. It created this dominant visual language where a man's holistic identity, his face, his distinct emotions, his humanity, was just entirely optional. In fact, within this specific visual grammar, the face was considered an outright hindrance to the utility of the image.
That is wild, and it sets up a fascinating historical baseline. But, it brings up a huge causal question for me. Media might have created this visual template, sure, but why do everyday men adopt this exact template in their private lives?
Right.
Because when a guy is messaging someone on a dating app, he isn't a film director trying to maximize viewer immersion, He's just a regular person trying to flirt. So why default to the gonzo aesthetic?
Well, when we move from the professional adult industry to just casual participants in modern digital culture, the psychological motivation flips entirely. The individual cropping his face today isn't trying to create immersive media. He's trying to mitigate risk.
Okay, so it's about privacy.
Yes, he's seeking privacy. But Dench points out a massive cognitive disconnect happening here. If you look at the empirical data from long-term adult content creators and cybersecurity experts, the actual statistical baseline risk of digital blackmail, exposure, or catastrophic social recognition for a random person sending a private photo is remarkably low.
Really?
Yes. Yet, the perceived risk among everyday men is overwhelmingly high.
Okay, I have to push back on that a little bit on behalf of anyone listening right now, because honestly, it feels perfectly logical to protect your career or your social standing. We see stories about revenge porn, digital blackmail, and catastrophic leaks on our timelines all the time.
That's true.
Teachers lose their jobs, executives step down. The internet is forever, so it doesn't feel like a phantom risk. It feels like a very present danger.
And that feeling of imminent present danger is very real to the person experiencing it. But it's also exactly what Dench unpacks using Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman's concept of the availability heuristic.
Okay, remind us what that is.
So our brains are fundamentally wired to estimate the probability of an event based on how easily we can recall examples of it. Right. And because instances of digital exposure, revenge porn, or high-profile blackmail are inherently scandalous, they go viral.
Right.
They're heavily sensationalized in the news and on social media, so they occupy a completely disproportionate amount of our cognitive space.
I hear the statistics, but it's hard to tell a guy who just watched someone's career get ruined on Twitter that his fear is just a heuristic. It only takes one leak to ruin a life.
And that total destruction is the key driver here.
Yeah.
The paper compares this cognitive distortion to the fear of flying.
Oh, interesting.
right? Rare catastrophic plane crashes make international headlines for weeks. They're terrifying, they're highly visual, and highly memorable. And because of that vividness, millions of people suffer from aviation phobia, wildly overestimating the danger of getting on a plane.
Even though flying is statistically super safe.
Exactly. It's incredibly safe compared to, say, driving your car to the grocery store. The human brain overestimates the probability of digital exposure based on the extreme memorability of its absolute worst-case scenarios.
Right, right. And that leads directly into what Dench calls high-stakes loss aversion.
Uh,
Because for a guy operating in a mainstream corporate job or within a traditional family structure, the imagined consequence of a leaked photo isn't just a brief moment of embarrassment, right?
oh, not at all.
It's professional disenfranchisement. It's
Yeah.
total social obsolescence. Like,
Right.
the perceived penalty is losing absolutely everything.
Yes, and when the perceived penalty is totalized like that, human beings engage in extreme asymmetrical caution. We overcorrect. The physical act of cropping the face out of the photo functions as a psychological security blanket.
Wow.
It provides what Dench calls the illusion of control. By editing the file, by physically severing his face from his body, the sender feels a comforting sense of agency over what is basically an inherently uncontrollable digital environment.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Dench highlights this devastating, tragic irony that's built into this defense mechanism. Because in trying to protect their identity from this statistically minor threat of exposure, men are proactively inflicting a form of digital self-erasure.
Yes, they are.
They are deliberately stripping away their facial expressions, their smiles, their unique human vulnerability. And those are the exact elements scientifically required to generate genuine interpersonal attraction with the person they're talking to.
It is the ultimate self-defeating behavior.
Totally.
I mean, you are reaching out because you want connection, you want to be desired, but your overriding fear of exposure causes you to amputate the very parts of yourself that make you human and relatable to the other person.
Which leads us to a really uncomfortable question. If you are that terrified of the risk, if the loss aversion is really that high, why send the photo at all?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, like I just turned my phone off. Why not just say, hey, I don't send pictures, let's just grab coffee? Why is the default action to send a faceless anatomical photo rather than just abstaining altogether?
Well, to answer that, Dench argues we have to look past the immediate psychology of internet dating. We have to examine a much older, deeper sociological framework, which is the concept of male expendability.
Okay, I need you to walk us through this because this is a pretty heavy concept.
It is. Male expendability is a theory rooted in sociology and gender studies that describes the structural positioning of men throughout history. The core observation is that for centuries, civilization has essentially sustained itself by treating the male body as a highly durable, replaceable, and sacrificial instrument.
Yeah.
Historically, the primary mechanism of male socialization has been tethering a man's self-worth strictly to his external utility and his mechanical output.
Meaning society doesn't teach men that they have intrinsic value just for existing. Like, their value is entirely based on what they can do, what they can produce, or I guess what they can physically protect.
Exactly. Look at the historical macro structures of high-risk labor allocation that Dench cites. When society needs coal, who is sent down into the mines to breathe toxic dust?
Man.
When a city is burning, who is expected to run into the collapsing building? When a nation goes to war, who is drafted by the millions as sacrificial soldiers? Men.
Right.
In all these contexts, preserving the individual's unique humanity, their fears, their distinct personality, that is actually considered an impediment to institutional efficiency.
I love the analogy you can draw here with uniforms. Think about the miner's soot completely covering a face, or the identical military uniforms handed to soldiers. Those things physically obscure the individual.
Yes, they do.
Like when you put on the uniform, you are culturally required to stop being an individual with hopes, dreams, and a distinct face.
Yeah.
You become a replaceable unit of labor or defense. The soot and the uniform literally turn a person into a function. So what Dench is saying is that the faceless digital proxy, the cropped photo, is essentially the modern meat suit equivalent of a soldier's uniform.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Because in every iteration throughout history, the individual face, which is our primary biological canvas for human emotion, empathy, and unique identity, is erased to ensure the uninhibited execution of a physical function.
Yeah.
So when a modern man sends a faceless image today, he isn't just copying a VHS aesthetic or, worrying about a data leak. He is executing a micro behavior that directly reflects centuries of this macrostructural conditioning.
That is so dark.
He is operating on the deeply internalized assumption that his holistic humanity, his complex emotions, his character, they hold absolutely no transactional value in the modern economy of desire.
He literally assumes the person on the other end doesn't want my face or my complicated feelings. They just want the physical tool.
Right. And by offering only the physical tool, he conforms to the ancient societal dictate that he is only as valuable as his mechanical output. Dench frames this as a profound form of self-objectification. The modern man is viewing his own body through the exact same detached utilitarian lens that society has historically used to evaluate his labor.
It's just wild to think about it that way, because we spend a lot of time analyzing the objectification of women in media and society, which is obviously a massive, pervasive, and well-documented issue. But Dench is pointing out that men are actively, relentlessly self-objectifying based on this historical blueprint of expendability. They are literally treating themselves as disposable spare parts.
And they are doing it voluntarily. I mean, they're engaging in this massive self-erasure under the guise of digital privacy and just, modern dating norms.
But there has to be a breaking point, right? Like, what happens to a person's mind when they constantly treat themselves as a disposable, faceless tool? There has to be a massive psychological tax for compartmentalizing your identity like that day after day.
There is. The psychological consequences Dench outlines are severe, and worse, they are cumulative. When a man continuously compartmentalizes his identity, when he actively and repeatedly severs his physical body from his face and his public persona, he induces a form of psychological fracturing.
Okay.
The first major consequence is that this fragmentation fosters intense body objectification and performance anxiety.
Well, yeah, because if you remove the face, you remove the personality, the charm, the humor, all that's left is a biological machine being presented for grading.
Exactly. Men begin viewing their own bodies not as integrated human forms worthy of holistic affection, but as biological machines subject to mechanical failure or arbitrary metric evaluation.
Ugh, it's awful.
And this heavily contributes to rising rates of male body dysmorphia. When you strip away the face, your romantic or sexual currency is suddenly reduced entirely to isolated physical metrics.
That makes so much sense. If the only thing you are putting forward on a screen is a disembodied part, then of course you're going to obsess over the aesthetics, the size, and the performance of that specific part. You completely lose the ability to feel confident in who you are as a whole person because you aren't even letting anyone see the whole person.
And that leads directly to the second major consequence Dench identifies, which is the absolute erasure of empathy and the reinforcement of profound emotional isolation.
Right.
We know biologically and psychologically that true interpersonal intimacy requires reciprocal vulnerability. And vulnerability is fundamentally dependent on facial recognition.
Because of how our brains work, correct?
Yes, we have mirror neurons in our brains. Building empathy requires eye contact. It requires the shared reading of emotional microexpressions. A smile, a grimace, a look of hesitation. These are the actual building blocks of human connection.
You literally need a face to build empathy. Like, you can't empathize with a wrench, and you can't empathize with a disembodied proxy.
Precisely. When digital communication architectures encourage individuals to interact as anonymous transactional entities, it severely stunts the development of emotional literacy. You are starving the very biological mechanisms designed to help you connect with another human being.
So what does this all mean? Like, for the guy swiping on his phone right now, it means he is trapped in a devastating feedback loop.
It really does.
Dench lays it out so clearly. Men adopt this stoic, faceless mask because they think it provides digital security and because it complies with this historical cultural script of being a useful, replaceable tool. But the price of wearing that mask is absolute emotional isolation.
Yes.
By cropping out their faces, they are actively destroying the empathy they are desperately seeking on these apps in the first place. And in the end, the interaction just leaves them feeling profoundly disposable and fundamentally unlovable for who they actually are as full human beings.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Dench argues that this systemic de-individuation directly contributes to the contemporary crisis of male mental health and the epidemic of male loneliness we see in the headlines every single day.
Yeah, you see it everywhere.
Reclaiming mental health isn't just about logging off or taking a break from apps. It requires explicitly dismantling this utility-first paradigm. It requires reintegrating the face with the body. Men have to break the cycle of self-objectification to be recognized and to recognize themselves as whole human beings.
This has been such a journey. I mean, for everyone listening, just think about how wild this is. What seems on the surface like a crude, confusing, or just downright annoying digital habit is actually a profound cultural artifact.
It really is.
It's a massive collision of media history, starting from the 1980s VHS era, cognitive biases fueled by our fear of public exposure, and a centuries-old societal blueprint that commodifies male utility while completely discarding the male soul.
It really forces us to look past the surface behavior.
Mhm.
Instead of just reacting with annoyance, we can start to recognize the invisible historical structural forces at play behind the screen.
And that is exactly why this matters to you, the listener. Whether you are navigating the digital dating world yourself and receiving these images, whether you are trying to better understand the mental health struggles of the men in your life, or whether you're just a curious observer of modern internet culture.
Absolutely.
Understanding these underlying mechanisms, from the availability heuristic to the immense historical weight of male expendability, it fosters a much deeper empathy. It gives us the tools to apply critical thinking to behaviors that otherwise just seem, I don't know, chaotic or irrational.
It gives us a framework for understanding.
Yeah.
And I think it leaves us with a critical question to consider, one that builds on Dench's foundation, but really looks toward the future. Well, we've spent this time seeing how our current digital architectures and our cognitive biases actively punish vulnerability and reward disembodiment. But what would a digital platform actually look like if it were structurally designed to reverse this,
Oh, wow.
right? How could we engineer digital interactions that actually reward holistic human integration? How do we build spaces where it feels fundamentally safer to show up as a whole, vulnerable person than to hide behind a disposable proxy?
That is such a powerful thought to end on. How do we design the future of the internet for humanity instead of just mechanical utility? Well, we have unpacked a massive amount of behavioral science and history today, and I really hope this gives you a completely new perspective the next time you are swiping, messaging, and just hoping for a real connection in this crazy digital landscape. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us, and we will catch you on the next one.